It's an honor and a pleasure to welcome everybody into this lovely seminar room where we are actually hosting our event, first time I think for the Canadian Institute of Ukrainian Studies, together with our partners, Faculty of Native Studies. Most importantly, of course, welcome to Pembina Hall, second level, but most importantly, welcome to Mesquachi Waskahikan, the land of many, many indigenous peoples, Métis people, the land which has given us all the opportunities to work, live, and collaborate and build partnerships as we are now in the process of doing together with Faculty of Native Studies. We have a guest from overseas, my colleague, Crimean Tatar scholar, I will introduce you in a second, who will come and present her presentation on Crimean Tatar history, I think from an angle of microhistory, from an angle of looking at particular family there. But I wanted to first point out that at Canadian Institute of Ukrainian Studies, we have been working over the course of a number of years really by now, trying to contribute intellectually, partnership-wise, into growing the discourse on Indigenous Ukrainian relations in Canada. You probably have known and have heard that we have founded awards and research grants. We are awarding them to scholars of worthy pursuits across the nation. So we've supported some projects in Alberta. We had our inaugural fellowship was in fact won by Lisa Hritsун, who is probably well known in Faculty of Native Studies, obviously. And then next grant went to Alberta, and this particular year we're supporting a project in British Columbia, which is covering the relationships and partnerships between the Ukrainian culture in BC, but also I should know better. I will remember the Stolen Nation people who I also have been somewhat exposed to through my work in the University of Saskatchewan. I would like to welcome maybe a colleague of mine, Adam Godry, who could probably say a few words about on behalf of the Faculty of Native Studies. And then I will introduce everyone.
So hello everyone, my name is Adam Godry. I'm Vice Dean of the Faculty of Native Studies. Yeah, I'm Métis. I've worked here a number of years now. We're very excited because, I mean, we've always been neighbors with the Canadian Institute of Ukrainian Studies. And so we've been, over the last few months, been working on collaborations because obvious importance to us are local Indigenous issues. I mean, we live and work in Edmonton and in Alberta. We've talked a lot about Indigenous Ukrainian relationships locally, but we have also been working increasingly to kind of support Crimean Tatar people, to think about ways that what we can do here to kind of support global Indigenous peoples around the world that have kind of very similar struggles to our own here. So we're very excited to welcome you here today, and we're very excited to welcome all of you here, and hope, this is one of many future collaborations between our two units, and we're very happy to have you all here. So, thanks a lot.
Thank you, Adam. So a few words about our guest and speaker today. Emine Ziyatdinova is Indigenous scholar, a Crimean Tatar documentary photographer, and co-founder and director of NGO Ukrainian War Archive, a digital photo archive of the Russian-Ukrainian War. Born in Uzbekistan, her family was deported from Crimea in 1944 by the Stalin regime. Growing up as a part of the Crimean Tatar minority in Ukraine, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, she gained a first-hand experience and understanding of the human rights issues faced by ethnic minorities and the challenges stemming from the economic and political transition in her country. Her unique perspective places her at the intersection of documentary photography, sociology, human rights, and journalism. Emine holds MA's degree in sociology from Ivan Franko National University of Lviv and photojournalism from Ohio University School of Visual Communication. For the last number of years, from 2012 to 2017, she worked extensively in documentary photography and journalism in Ukraine before relocating to the UK. And there, she continues her expertise to share her expertise with the nonprofit sector, working with organizations such as Rory Peck Trust and the Thomson Reuters Foundation. Emine's work was supported by a Fulbright Scholarship and the Magnum Foundation Emergency Fund Fellowship. Her photography projects have been showcased in exhibitions both in Ukraine but also internationally. And we will have another event in town next week in case you would be around. Welcome, Emine.
Thank you.
Please, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, everyone, for organizing it and for having me here. Thank you for introduction, Natalia. Today, I'll be speaking mostly about my family history and my own experience and experience of my grandmother and my mother, and how we lived through the different historical events, starting from 1937 in Crimea, going through deportation, life in Uzbekistan in places of deportation, and return to Crimea. And also a little bit about most current events of annexation of Crimea and occupation of Crimea. I hope I will be able to cover everything in this short time, but also I want to remind you all that this year actually we commemorating its 80th anniversary of deportation of Crimean Tatars on 18th of May, where my grandparents actually were deported and they experienced it firsthand. And when within 2 days NKVD troops deported entire population of Crimean Tatars, 200,000 people from peninsula forcefully to Uzbekistan. And I want to remind that in result of deportation by Soviet NKVD number statistics, 20% died, but with a different kind of scholars estimate it's up to 30 to 40% of Crimean Tatar population vanished within these 2 years of deportation, including of horrendous environment and disease which they faced, and hunger when they to the places where they deported. I also will be sharing some photographs of my photographs I took of my family. But all of this presentation is pretty much based on the interviews I took with my grandmother and my mom. And I took a number of interviews with my grandmother, and it started as a student work in 2006 when I was studying sociology, and I did oral history course. And of course, I had my grandmother at home, and I was like, I'm going to interview her about your experience. Why would to put much more effort to find someone else? And so that's how it started, and I interviewed her multiple times going back, and the last time I interviewed her in 2017 after the annexation of Crimea already. And I want to say that the content of interviews also changed over time, and what was told changed. And I think mostly because she's starting seeing me as an adult woman instead of the student and like a grandchild just. And so and maybe just because I grew up myself and I could have asked different questions and more of what I was interested in. And the same with my mom. I did a long interview, biographical interview with her in 2022, actually, the first time I interviewed her. And I learned quite a lot about my mom, which I've never expected to learn about, actually. And I interviewed her after that, actually, a couple times more on the details which I kind of missed out, I guess. So, and I just want to probably start with putting deportation. And deportation is quite a major event in the families and family histories, and the point of conversation within Crimean Tatar families. And as I remember myself growing up, I learned about deportation quite young, and I learned it from my grandmother as well, and from school. And I went to school in 1994 in Crimea. But I want to put it in context, because we always, when it's a family story, we always think that's how unique it is and how our story is unique compared to others. But if you put it in the more a broader history of Soviet Union, actually there were only during Second World War, Soviet Union deported about 1.5 million people. And it's not the ones who on social class, it's on ethnic basis. Pretty much 8 entire ethnic nation, it was en masse deportation of 8 entire nationalities. And those were Karachay, Volga Germans, Karachay, Kalmyks, Chechens, Ingush, Balkars, Crimean Tatars, and Meshetian Turks. And if you look at the map, it's mostly it's a borderland of Soviet Union. It's mostly Caucasus, Crimea, Volga Germans, it's for the other reason, because Volga Germans are more, it's not, it's actually only one non-Muslim, I think, out of this group, and it's more in the center, but it's more on ideology of war with Nazi Germany than other things. And I guess I need to mention that the first deportation of ethnic group in Soviet Union which happened was Koreans, which happened in 1937. And these 1.4 million people, which I said during World War II, it's actually doesn't include Koreans. It's a bit different time of history, and so it's in mass deportation, quite violent, a lot of lack of food, and people were mostly deported to the Urals, Siberia, and Central Asia, where they were not used to climate-wise and things like that. And as I mentioned, my maternal grandmother haven't survived the deportation, so she died right after. So one of my maternal grandmother ended up in the orphanage, and the male population so my great-grandfather on my mom's side was in the Red Army at the time, and he so he was not deported directly for Crimea, but when he returned from the army, he was sent to Uzbekistan. And so Crimean Tatars were not allowed to go back to Crimea, and we were not allowed till 1989. It's pretty much till almost the end of Soviet Union. And Crimean Tatars with Meshetian Turks, there were pretty much only 2 of these 8 nationalities which were not allowed to go back after Stalin died and after Khrushchev's speech in 1956, when he actually named this in mass forced transfer as a crime committed by Stalin. But Crimean Tatars as ethnicity, Soviet Union tried to erase it. So in passports, because Soviet passports had ethnicity line, and in the passport there were no Crimean Tatar, it was only Tatars. And so what the policy was is they were trying to say that Crimean Tatars are the same as Kazan Tatars or Ural Tatars, and so they belong to Asia. And so there is no ethnicity called Crimean Tatars. They pretty much not only deported, but also tried to erase all of that. So in Soviet Union, there were no mention of ethnicity as Crimean Tatars officially. I'm going back now to my family history. And on the photograph is my great-grandfather on my dad's side, and his 2 sisters, and one of his sons, who I've never met, but it's my grandmother's brother. And it's probably like, the boy was born in 1920, so it's probably 1922, I would guess, from the child age. Photos like probably early 20s. And why I'm showing this photograph, that is another photograph of my family as well. It's the same, that's my great-grandfather, and that is the son, which is a little boy on the other photograph. And so my grandmother hasn't born yet. So it means that it's like about 1930, 10 years later, or 13 years later. And so I asked my grandmother once what was her first memory of Crimea, and I would read answer she gave to me. when I was 5, in 1937, our house was searched at night. I needed to pee, so my mom and I went out into the corridor, where I sat on the potty. There was a small kerosene lamp barely burning. My mom said to me, "Don't cry, my dear. Look, Sheikh Baba is also here." I looked over, and in the corner, an old bearded man was sitting, wearing a turban. It turned out to be Sheikh Baba from the mosque. They searched our entire closet and bedroom. I was afraid and crying. When I finished, my mom put me to bed, and I fell asleep again. They took my father away that night. I remember it very well. And when she told me that, it's like, so I was like, Sheikh Baba, is it like sounds like kind of like a character from like a fairy tale? Is that even real what she's telling me, or like does she really remember it? I actually did find the archival documents in a state Ukrainian archive on the arrest of my great-grandfather, and he was arrested along at the same day with Sheikh Mifa Abkirim. So she actually does remember the name correctly, who was born 1872. My great-grandfather, it was, as you all know, it was 1937, 1938 purges, Stalin purges in Soviet Union, when millions of people were executed, and so Crimean Tatars were no different than anyone else, I guess. So, what is important about these purges, there were also a lot of intelligentsia and people who were associated with religion, or who owned the land previously, or who Soviet Union had seen in any way that they could be like unloyal, or like potentially in some way to say something against, but everything I even don't want to say something against, like, because everything you would say was political. I think it's like very similar actually to what's happening in Crimea right now. It doesn't matter what you say. It's just like everything political, and you can be arrested for it. But it's 1937, so my great-grandfather, he was executed in early 38 by shooting. And the document itself says that he had a Turkish citizenship, and he used to be a kulak, so he had a land and he used a labor, and he was doing anti-Soviet agitation, what they said. And Sheikh Mifa Abkirim was, his sentence was a little bit different. I didn't include it here, but it was on religious gatherings and anti-Soviet propaganda, I guess, anti-Soviet, I don't know, agitation? Yeah. So, what is interesting about it, my grandmother and her family have never knew, and they didn't learn what happened to my great-grandfather till they returned to Crimea. And what is interesting, let me actually to show the photographs, another photograph of before I go to that. That's her brother, the little boy in the first photograph. And this is a photograph, actually I have this photograph at home. He took this photo in 1941 in Lviv while he was in Red Army. He sent it so he just gave it to someone to send it to the family, and end up in my family hands in some point in Uzbekistan. And what it says, like, he addresses his younger brother, and he says, "Do not forget me, please love me and keep a memory about me. If I will vanish on the front line, you would have to take my place and go to defend our motherland." In this point, it means the Soviet Union. And I find it history quite interesting how the system itself didn't allow families to speak about what's happening, and actually families didn't know what was happening. And so his father is taken away and he is killed, and he pretty much executed by Soviet Union for no reason, for pretty much not fitting into Soviet system of like whatever like view, or like as could be potentially like having Turkish citizenship at some point. And the family runs away from that village so the older brother would not be affected. And older brother is ending up in the Red Army because he's getting mobilized. And he's getting mobilized, he's sent to fight for Soviet Union, where he started believe that he defends his motherland, Soviet Union. And so I also wanted to read a passage about this, about how they were waiting for them. So it's my grandmother remembering. Throughout my childhood, my mother lived with the hope that my father would turn up one day and my brother would return from the Soviet army. She claimed that many people were sent to Samarkand in 1938 and that pilgrims had even spotted my father there. Whenever she acquired some jam or sugar, she would split it in half, saving one half in case my father or brother came back. And so that is just like a family events like which happened before deportation actually. But deportation was also not much different than I'll go back to her photograph. I was no different in terms of how it became no conversation topic in families and how it was not allowed to be remembered even in talk in the families. But before that, I also would like to read just a passage on how my grandmother remembered the day of deportation and the early years after deportation. Early in the morning, I ran back to our house crying. We are being sent away. Auntie Nasib told me. They are putting on their new dresses. We are being expelled. The soldiers in our house got up as well, urging us to hurry up and take only food with us. We got dressed and walked to the square between the mosque and the well, where some people were already gathered. We waited on the square until it got dark. Also, although the adults couldn't leave, the kids were allowed to return home and take some belongings. Throughout the day, young Russian women and boys from the neighboring village went from the house to house, taking whatever they wanted. And what did I bring? Mom, look, I brought your golden-colored jug. My mother replied anxiously, Oh God, is this false it will break? Why did you bring this china jug, you thoughtless child? It would be better if you'd brought me metal one, where we can boil water. My brother Amiramed, who was 3 years older, brought some corn and flour. Late at night, they loaded us into the back of the small trucks with 3 other families. It was dark, and nobody can see anything or knew what was happening. I was crying, clutching my doll. My mom became irritated and snatched my doll, tossing it aside. Here is the Quran, she said, handing me the book. Hold on to it and nothing else. Some people tried to bring their bags into the truck, but they were thrown back. The soldiers had to load people, not belongings. As a result, we had no mattresses or pillows when we arrived in Uzbekistan. We only took 1 quilt. In the middle of the night, we reached Yevpatoria train station, were put into wagons and sent away. The wagon had 2 small windows on each side, but they were shut later. Avasharfi and Lenifer were in our wagon. They had just recovered from typhoid. The sick ones were on the one side and the rest of us were on the other. Whenever the train stopped, my brother would quickly run out and fetch some water. During longer stops, my mom and other women would jump out and make small flatbreads. The train would start moving again, leaving the bread half cooked. They provided us with food only once during the 18-day journey, and there was late bread. And all men died. The adults told us to not look and instead search for lies on each other. Later, they left his body at one of the stations in the middle of Kazakhstan. People already began to starve on the way. The starving people started dying after a few months in Uzbekistan. But my mother didn't sit still. She went around the village to the Uzbek neighbors, talked to the old ladies. She sewed up everything for them, leaving not a single garment torn. They fed her and even gave her pieces of flat bread, or flour, or corn, so that we children wouldn't die. They were also hungry. They didn't have it either, but among them there were those who gave this much. And she ate half herself, and half hidden she brought to us. I made a soup. I picked grass, horse sorrel, onions, mixed them with flour and made porridge. Not porridge, but rather a thin soup. We ate, and my mother gave me a few more spoonfuls in separate, very little bowl. Go, there is a girl who is dying of hunger next to you. Feed this girl, but don't show your brother. Of course, my brother was already a teenager and was protecting us. We ourselves are dying of hunger. I hid the bowl under an apron, fed her and gave her water. Then my mother went to bury those who died. Old sheets and rags she could find, she used to wrap their bodies to bury. She also had several strings of pearls. In Uzbekistan, she divided them into pieces and sold them to wealthier Uzbeks. Clothes, scarves, whatever she had, she sold everything. We had no bed either. We cut reeds ourselves, then made a bed. In Uzbekistan, my mother used a satin duvet which my father brought from Turkey. She sewed an Uzbek dress from satin and sold it. And we made ourselves a cover. A simple cover from my mother's old dresses. And the three of us slept under one cover, and so we survived. So that's my mother's memories of deportation itself. And so, as I said, like pretty much entire population was deported, including the pretext and not the pretext, but how Soviet Union justified it. It was pretty much saying that Crimean Tatars were collaborators with Nazi regime, and of course this was a false accusation, and pretty much didn't make any distinguish between anyone. And so Crimean Tatars who were serving in the Red Army were pretty much deported to Uzbekistan as well, the ones who didn't return. And what I wanted to just point out as well, why I did include this map, is that it was clear ethnic cleansing of Crimean Peninsula. One of the things which they've done, as the Soviet government done within like pretty much the same next year of deportation of Crimean Tatars, they renamed every single village and city, even mountains and rivers. Only thing they didn't remain, it was seaports, because they were used for navy. And because all of these names in Crimea were pretty much in native Crimean Tatar language, which is Turkic language. And I just want to give you the map. It's actually a Soviet map of 1926, which actually still have all Crimean Tatar maps. Well, not maps, names. And I just wanted to share with you and show where these villages my grandmother mentioned are. And so this is, do you see it? This is called Stary Burnak, Eski Burnak. That is the village where, actually that's the place where she was in the village at the day of deportation, and where my great-grandfather was arrested too. And the village where her mom was from, which she also mentioned, but not in the passages I actually read, it's called Buyuk As. So for me, it's very interesting to see this map. It's actually, we are talking about probably this map is very similar to what the names of the places were in 1944, which is 80 years ago. It's not so long, right? And when we returned to Crimea, it was 1991, so we are talking about like 60 years. And I myself, for me, these names are foreign names. And I'm being Crimean Tatar who grew up in Crimea. I grew up in northern Crimea as well. I don't know these names, and it just have been wiped out as a cultural past. And not only the names were wiped out, pretty much the archives and the history got wiped out as well. And it got to the level, I actually have been doing some research on my village, and I saw. It's a Soviet archive. It was online. It's available. It's about it's about Nazi executions and all the kind of different villages, and about partisan movement and stuff like that. So I've been like just looking through some documents, and 1943, like the documents still include Crimean Tatar names, which like sound like Turkic, and they do have them. And there is this partisan here and this partisan. In 1944, suddenly in March, it seems that there is no single Crimean Tatar. It was before deportation, so it's 2 months before deportation. All the names were wiped out. No single document include any Turkic name. It's only Slavic names there. And it's actually very interesting, like looking back to the history as what's happening in Crimea right now. I work with Natalia on some project, and so I've been looking through the history of one of the villages, and it's a new website. It's a Berezovka village. It's a new website within Russian governmental websites. And it's the history of the village. And it's a village where my family first moved, and we lived there for 1 year. And I know that there is quite big Crimean Tatar population in the village, up to 30%. And there were, in some point, Crimean Tatar head of the collective farm, and my dad is actually head of the little ambulatory, like hospital there. And there is a lot of Crimean Tatars. And I looked through whole website, which includes history from 20s. There is also no single Crimean Tatar name even mentioned in whole website. It's just very interesting in a way how Soviet Union and today Russian Federation imply kind of history politics, and how they just wipe out whatever they don't want to see, or they don't want to what don't play into their hands, or like do not go along with their narratives and propaganda. And I also talking about memory, I also wanted to read you. That's my grandmother, actually. She was the head of the school, and this is Soviet elections happening there. And I included this photograph. I actually think it's an amazing photograph, but it's also partly because my grandmother, she became pioneer, she became Komsomol, and then she became a member of Communist Party. Experiencing all of that. And for me, it's like in a way, the way I remember her in the 90s when she already retired, and how she was so pro-nationalistic, like not nationalistic, but pro-Crimean Tatar and stuff. Like, so for me, it's like almost amusing to read about her communist past. So for me, it was a big question: why, how that happened? And so there is a passage which kind of explains it as well, quite well, and I'm going to read it to you. As a child, I didn't know what this was, that it was deportation. How could I know? We continued living, and I told everyone at school in Uzbekistan that we weren't deported, that was a war going on, and we were evacuated in 1944. My mother and Aunt Zilha were always whispering to each other and crying. Whenever I approached them, they would stop. I would ask why. My mother replied, "If you know everything, they'll kick you out of school. You won't go to school." That's how we lived, and they didn't tell me anything. Every day they prayed to return to Crimea. They cursed Stalin and said, "Allah boynunun ursununan, let God punish him on the neck." When the old women gathered in our house, they used to say, "Soon we'll be going back to Crimea. People already saw the wagons. They brought us here to Uzbekistan by mistake." I heard that. In 1953, Stalin died. I was in 10th grade. We attended the march and cried that our leader had died. But then we turned around the corner and laughed, wiping our eyes. I just wanted to read, it's quite interesting about, I think like it's throughout Eastern Europe, and it's very common thing for Ukraine, and I think like all of these post-Soviet countries, when the families pretty much didn't share their own story with their kids, and were trying to protect their kids from what was going on. And I just want to actually make a parallel to today again with Russian repression machine. In a couple years ago, in 2021, I think, or 22, Russian Federation had a new class in the curriculum for schools, including the primary school for primary school kids, which called "Разговоры о важном," or conversation about important, which pretty much propaganda lessons, which pretty much teach kids about patriotism, about Nazis in Ukraine, about Nazis like meaning military operation in Ukraine and stuff like that, which pretty much completely twisted narratives and propaganda. And I want to say, it's like I talked to my relatives, and a lot of relatives, like, of course they didn't want the kids to go, but then you do not send them because they go to school, and it's actually the state schools. But at the same time, the kids come back, what do you tell them? Because you start afraid that they go back to school and tell what they heard from parents. And that is like kind of vicious cycle. Of course, it's not, I think it's hard to compare Soviet Union during Stalin with today. Of course, today is not as bad, but during the Stalin times, it was, as a repressive machine worked much, not better, what's like, it was much more repressive. But there is a lot of I find a lot of parallels with the story and how what's happening in Crimea today and how, and that is my again, that is my grandmother with her mom in Uzbekistan, and there is other funny stories about her, like how she. So in this age, when my grandmother was working in the school as a director, her mom was when they had a fight, they would call her communist, or she would call her haram communist, which means kind of, I don't know, sinful, kind of like a bad communist, and it's actually also funny to me because I remember my grandmother like every morning, 11 o'clock after coffee, reading her Quran, and not Arabic language, but Turkish translation, she also, one of the other funny things she was telling me actually about school. I came back, like it was 2016 actually, and she's like, "Oh, Emine, you know what? I just read this article in the magazine. Apparently it's not Alexander Popov who invented radio." And I was like, yeah. She's like, there were some Italian scientists. I was like, okay. And she said, and you know what I did? I was like, every single year for my physics, she taught mathematics and physics in school. Every year in school, like I wrote on the chalkboard that Alexander Popov is invented radio. It's like, and she was like, oh, I'm just such a, like, I was such a good propagandist. Like she joked. But it's she was rediscovering all this history, I think, own history after Soviet Union collapse. But it's not only about like actually history of Crimea deportation, but it's also like such a things as physics and Alexander Popov. And going into my mom, this is my mom with her parents and her brother. And so clearly my parents already were born in Uzbekistan in deportation. They didn't experience by themselves. And so this is a photograph of 1977, and they took it in Bakhchisarai. On the background is Khan Sarai, which was Bakhchisarai used to be a capital of Crimean Khanate. It was a Crimean Tatar state. It was vassalite of Ottoman Empire, but at the same time they had quite a lot of autonomy and state institutions. And so this is the first time. My mom is 16, and she's the first time she went to Crimea with her parents for the holiday. Crimean Tatars were not allowed to go back to settle to Crimea, but as every other Soviet citizens, they were allowed to go back to visit as a holiday destination. And I just want to read that passage of my mom's first encounter with Crimea for the first time in person. The first time we went to Crimea for vacation in 1977, I was in 9th grade. We were shocked because everything was available in the shop there. Everything was cheap. At the diner, borscht with chicken costed 36 kopecks. Cheap cherries were sold everywhere. In Uzbekistan, cherries were expensive and in short supply. We could buy a whole wheel of cheese. Eating cheese with bread every morning was a luxury we couldn't afford in Uzbekistan. Probably Crimea was supplied differently because it was a resort destination. We went to Bakhchisarai, and it was the beginning of June. Everything was in bloom. The lavender field and poppy fields were beautiful. My mother said, "Look how beautiful it is. The Tatars lived here. They took everything away from us." When we went on guided tours, my mother always got mad. The guides always said the Turkic people and Greeks lived here, but they didn't mention Crimean Tatars at any point. Of course, it made her angry. But she didn't argue with them. It was not acceptable then. She told us her ancestor had lived there, that we Crimean Tatars had always lived there, and that what they said wasn't true. And actually had found, like on some flea market, a little a tour guide to Crimea of Soviet times. It was interesting to look. It's like a whole tour guide is about quite a lot about Bakhchisarai and Khan Palace, and also whole of Crimean, like didn't have a mention of Crimean Tatars. And also like on the part of Khan Sarai, it was about, of course, the part was about Alexander Pushkin visiting the Khan Palace and about that fountain of slurs, of tears, which like was designed after, I don't know, either he wrote a poem about it. He wrote a poem about it. That's right. And so that was interesting. And I just wanted also like to read the last passage from my mom to kind of end my family history part. It's like how they made decision to go back to Crimea in 1990. And of course there were like other parts, but I just want to put it in the I choose this passage because I want to put it in the larger perspective of the geopolitical events happening in Uzbekistan and in Crimea, in Soviet Union. So we decided to move back to Crimea in 1990. At the time, everyone was going. And the event with Meskhetian Turks in 1989 provided an additional push. The neighbors living on either side of my mother-in-law were Meskhetian Turks. Their wives used to make flatbread and tandoor, the special clay oven, while my son played with their kids. In the spring of 1989, there were events in Namangan, local disputes and fights between Uzbeks and Meskhetian Turks. Then the Uzbeks started to kick out the Meskhetian Turks deliberately and set their houses on fire. In our village, the Uzbeks filled a whole truck with stones, and someone pointed out where the Turks lived. They drove slowly down the street and started to throw stones at the Turks' houses. There were a loud banging. They threw stones at the windows and roof shingles, and I woke up from the loud noise. I was scared. My husband Bakhtiar grabbed a knife, which he had under the pillow. I told him, please don't go. Of course, everyone was afraid for their own life. I think he didn't leave the courtyard. When they drove to the next house to throw the stones, someone in it had a shotgun and fired it, killing one of the Uzbeks. The next day, the whole village was cordoned off by the police and internal troops. We thought that it could happen to Crimean Tatars as well, because we are also a minority. If they started to kick out the Turks, then they could do the same to Crimean Tatars. That's why the following year in autumn we moved. And so we moved to Crimea. That's already in my memory in 1990, and there were a lot of struggles with move, because it was right before Soviet Union collapsed, but under the pressure of Crimean Tatar national movement, pretty much, Soviet Union kind of allowed to Crimean Tatars to go back to Crimea legally, because they passed the law, but at the same time there were all different kind of degrees went down to the local authorities about not allowing Crimean Tatars to get registration in the places. If you didn't get registration, you can't get a job. And if you don't get a job, you cannot buy the house or get registration. So it was a vicious circle which pretty much Soviet government made to kind of to prevent Crimean Tatars to go back, even though legally they allowed. And also there were a lot of resentments towards Crimean Tatars in the local population, as there were a lot of propaganda and Soviet history books always named Crimean Tatars as traitors, like Nazi collaborators. And so, which is, the discourse is very strong, and I actually, as a person who lived in Lviv for some time and then in Kiev, I actually heard it from people of my age addressing me personally, that Crimean Tatars are traitors, and this discourse is quite strong and prevalent. And so it's also, there were a lot of issues with land and how, because even though the law passed, there were no kind of questions asked about providing houses or like any social, and also for us at least, both villages which we're coming from, they don't exist anymore. They only stones left. But for a lot of people who coming from Bakhchisarai or Sudak or Gurzuf, they actually went and saw their own houses still there, and there was someone living there. And the question is how you pretty much coming back to your homeland and someone lives in your house and you cannot get a registration or a job. And this is a photograph, actually, one of the settlements in Crimea, in Simferopol, on the outskirts of Simferopol. What happened is that Crimean Tatars started demanding some land for building the houses. It was more it's actually already late 90s. And they were called Meadows, yeah, Protest Meadows. And there were a big controversy about it with all different kind of politicians as well and the local population. And so this is a neighborhood where my brother actually also got a piece of land where the house has been built for 10 or 15 years with all family money were going into house, and it was from funding, the whole was built, and they finished it in 2021, and now they're refugees in Poland. So that's, but it's also a joke in Crimean Tatar community that we have went to Uzbekistan, and everyone always, whole time in the family history, always there will being a house being built. So it's one of the traits where everyone knows about it. So, And I'm just like sharing, I'll just share a couple of more photographs which I took in my own community and with my own family. This is a wedding day, and this is my mom at home, my dad. It's some photographs, it's not our house. A wedding, it's like dancing with money. And some daily life photographs. It's here I'm going to tell a couple words. It's a mosque. Crimean Tatars, like you probably already understood, but like Crimean Tatars are a Muslim community. And what happened after the annexation of Crimea in 2014 by Russian Federation? So Soviet Union had quite unique structure for the Islamic religion, which called Muftiyat. And what happened that pretty much Russia forced Crimean Muftiyat, so they took over of Crimean Muftiyat quite quickly in 2014. And what happened that all the repressions in Crimea, majority of them happened through the religious persecution. And what they did, they found one of the groups which called Hizb ut-Tahrir, which are Orthodox group which is claimed as a terrorist organization in Russia for no reason. There were other political reasons, like geopolitical reasons for it, but it exists as that organization works and like whatever, it's like this works and lives in Ukraine like normally, it's not whatever. But so they pretty much pick up the people and they put like, they find Quran in your house or some, it's like I don't know, some literature which like Islamic literature, and they claim that you belong to this terrorist organization, and then they find always there is some kind of testimony from the person with no face, like only audio recording testifying that, and so all the cases of persecution of Crimean Tatars are going around 3 cases. It's terrorism, extremism, and separatism. And the Russian Federation passed a new law on all of these 3 accounts in 2014, actually, after the annexation of Crimea. And so when we talk about the persecution of Crimean Tatars right now in Crimea, it's almost impossible to talk or cover in media as well, because the moment you say, as I said, Hizb ut-Tahrir is recognized as terrorist organization in Russia, and that law as well is very similar to US law on the terrorism. And it's almost impossible to explain. The moment you say Muslim and terrorism, that's it. You cannot explain anything else, even though the story is actually political repression and it's fake. But you cannot prove it's a fake because it's a court case happening right now. And the court case completely fabricated. And so if you recognize Russia as a state, you cannot say their courts completely fabricated either. And so, and another thing, what happened with mosques and all of these situations, that most of these mosques now, imams and mullahs have to report to FSB about all of the gatherings happening, including the gatherings for the death and baby born duas. They have to give like information how many people come, who came. I don't know if this is the list, but they need to give like information on gatherings and stuff like that. This is one of the iftars in my courtyard, and this is just a scene from the seaside, and again, daily life. This is one of the anniversary of annexation of Crimea in Simferopol, and this is Russian soldiers blocking the military base in Bakhchisarai in March of 2014. And looking at this photograph actually always makes me feel upset. I was working during annexation of Crimea as a TV producer in Crimea with media outlet, with a foreign TV media, TV2 Denmark. And looking back, I actually recently went to the Guardian's website to look the coverage of March of 2014, and it's just ridiculous when you look back and read it. It's like green man military troops without insignia, the unidentified soldiers, and there is no like straightforward saying that is Russia. And looking back and looking at the whole intelligence right now coming out about the war, full-scale war, which is not so far away, it's like only 10 years, and it's like, who these soldiers could have been? That is just like only that question is like how all the media outlet it was, and how all the states, including the Western countries and the US, would not name Russia as a perpetrator at that time, and that they like occupying the whole territory of the other country. It was green man till Vladimir Putin himself in the interview to his TV channel said that it was his troops there. Then when it's like the discourse changed, and it just like how much like on the defense or like not wanting to things to escalate actually lead eventually to the more escalation, because the perpetrators do not have any accountability for what they do. And when I talk about March 2014, this is pretty much open up the hands of Russian Federation to go into the east of Ukraine and start full-scale invasion in 2022. And that is also from Crimea. It's annexation of Crimea time. Sevastopol. This is one of the Crimean Tatar activists, Ibrahimov Ervin. It is actually different because he was kidnapped by FSB, actually not far from his house, and he was not affiliated with any religious things, and he was actually a political activist, and he was kidnapped. The scene in Bakhchisarai, and the daughter, one of the political prisoners. Just a scene in the village. They're picking up cherries. This is my school where I went and when I was growing up. I personally don't remember seeing Ukrainian president's portraits in my school ever, but Vladimir Putin arrived there as March of 2014, and there is all of this like symbolism like around it, and it's just crazy. This is, I think, photographs was taken in 2015, but and there is one of the rooms which used to be little room dedicated to Crimean Tatar history and culture, which I actually contributed something like some kind of embroiderment from my great-grandmother. And so I go there in 2015 to look, and it doesn't exist anymore. They took it away, and now it's a room of honorary students of school who had who finished school with distinctions, gold medals, and I was one of them. And so I look at my photograph there, and it's like, and St. George ribbon like goes around, and St. George ribbon is a symbol of Russian nationalism, pretty much. And I was like, oh my God, it's like you don't give your photograph, but they find your photograph and they put it up on the wall. This is a blockade of Crimea from Ukrainian side. It's one of the Ukrainian volunteers. Again, blockade, electric blockade when they blew up the electricity line to Crimea. My grandmother again. She passed away in 2021. And I think that's it. Yeah, it's like one thing maybe I mentioned, I put it's not my photograph. This is, I took it from Crim Reali. And this was the last time, rounding up about commemoration of deportation. So in 2014 was the last time when Crimean Tatars in Crimea were allowed to commemorate the deportation of Crimean Tatars with a mass gathering. And even though in 2014 it was still not allowed to do it in the main square, it was only in the cemeteries and in near mosques. And even then they deployed the military helicopters to circle around. And since then, after they passed this law on the extremism, terrorism, and separatism, the gathering of 5 people or more have to be reported to the to the local authorities and get permission. And since then, they are not giving permission to commemorate 18th of May or like deportation of Crimean Tatars. Instead, they have done a different commemoration, which is all different kind of, it's very Soviet actually as well, like deportation, like genocide of Armenians, deportation of Bulgarians and everything else, and they do it in April, I think, sometime. So that's more or less it, and I hope I didn't go over the time, yeah, thank you for listening to me and coming, and of course, if you have any questions, I'm happy to try to answer.
Thank you.
Thank you.